they had 7 major crops. They are barley, wheat, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. The earliest one to ripen was the barley. And so when they offered this offering of first fruits, it was a meal or a flour made out of barley grain, but it was to represent all of the harvest to come. And in fact, I think on the title I put a promise to come, because that's one of the things the Jewish people look for, is when they present this, that it is a promise to come. And then I think I took out a lot of the extra things that are up here. So you probably don't have A and B and 1 and 2 and all of that stuff, because it was like 4 pages long, and so I cut it down to where you only had 2. And then the time. There's a lot of differences about when exactly the Feast of First Fruits should be celebrated. In Leviticus 23:11, this is where they are commanded to do that. It says, "He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath." Okay? Day after the Sabbath. So the question is, which Sabbath? Remember when I told you, when we talked about Passover, you have Passover, which for us this year was April 1st. April 2nd then would be the first day of unleavened bread, and that is a special Sabbath. And then that was on a Thursday, so 2 days later you had Saturday, which would be the normal Sabbath. And then 5 days after that, on the next Friday, would be another special Sabbath at the end of Feast of Unleavened Bread. So do you do it after the first day of unleavened bread, or the last day of unleavened bread, or the Saturday that falls during that week? Now, every, I don't know how many actually it is, but you have like a 1 in 7 chance that first day of unleavened bread will also be on a Saturday, but most of the time it's not. I think most of the rabbis taught that it is the Saturday. So if, like I said, we started April 1st, which was a Wednesday night, so that Saturday, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, that would have been when they did the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I mean, the Feast of First Fruits. But there is some disagreement about that. I don't know that it matters. And then the observance, the thing they did, they would take a sheath, and actually they would mark a whole bunch of them. They would go through ahead of time, looking into the barley fields. And they did this, I'll say it again in a minute, but each family would have their own little plot that they did, but then the nation as a whole would have an area, and they would pick out the sheaths that looked the best. They looked like they were going to ripen at the right time. They were going to be the best looking, best producing plant that they have, and they would mark them. They put a ribbon around them or something, some way to mark it, and they would check on it and watch it for several days or weeks. And this is it's also kind of what they did with Jesus, because when he came in on the triumphal entry, they grilled him and they asked him questions for that whole week before he was crucified. And so they were testing to see whether he was who he said he was, which he is. But then, besides the meal that they would ground, and I'll get back to that in a minute, they would have a lamb, a year-old lamb, or 2 turtle doves for the family that was poor. And this is, each family did this. And then they'd have a drink offering of wine, and then the meal. They would take that barley flour and they'd mix it with olive oil. And people were forbidden to use any type or any part of the barley harvest, or any of the other harvest for that matter, but it was the first one, so they shouldn't have had any others. Anyway, but they should not use any of it to make any kind of meal, any kind of anything, until they offered the first fruits. So after they did that on that Saturday, Sunday, then they could eat from the field. But they didn't do it until after that. And if you neglected these offerings, it was considered robbery of God, which is found in Malachi 3:8. And if you've ever heard a preacher preach on Malachi, anywhere in Malachi, it's probably going to be on 3:8. Will you rob God? Nevertheless, and so anyway. So besides cleaning the house, getting rid of all the leaven and making sure everything was ready for Passover and the unleavened bread, they also had to choose this lamb for Passover and a lamb for the Feast of First Fruits. And prepare the feast and everything going on. They'd mark the fields. In fact, it said that the national one was a special field in the Ashes Valley. I don't know anything about that, but that would start early. They would, in the fall of the year, they would go out and they'd plow it. They'd sow it with barley during the winter months, and then they would oversee it, watch over it to make sure it was natural. You don't water it. You only let the rain water it. No artificial fertilization. Everything that causes that to grow is natural and comes from God. And then, like I said, they would mark a whole bunch of them. And then, the procession. Did I have that one? You have preparation and then procession. I'm not naming all of that right, so hopefully I haven't skipped too much for you. They would have a 3-man delegation that would go into this field, and they would walk into the field to get the sheaves when they were ready on that day. It would be on the Sabbath, the Saturday, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They would go out there right before dark, because remember, Sunday starts as soon as the sun goes down. So they would go out and they'd have everything marked. They knew exactly where they were at. They'd have 3 men kind of do that. They would have sickles in their hand and baskets under the arms, and they would position themselves around the plants that they were going to take. Yes, sir. Could be. It was just any of the sheaves, just bringing them. The Bible, there's a verse that it talks about that, but it also is reference to bringing in lost people to get them saved. So there's the correlation between both of those. And they would wait till they had the very last beads of sunlight showing, and then they'd ask these series of questions. And the men would, or one of the men ask, a priest would ask, I'm not sure, but the people would all answer. Has the sun set? Yes. With this sickle? Yes. Into this basket? Yes. On this Sabbath? Yes. Shall I reap? Yes. Shall I reap? Yes. They say that one twice. And then they would reap, and they would get enough to make an ephah of barley. That's about 2/3 of a bushel. Most of you in here, I think, know what a bushel is. So 2/3 of a bushel. It's quite a bit. And then they would take it to present it and to prepare it for presentation. So the next one is the presentation. They would take it into the temple. Now again, people would do this in their own home as well, but this is the national one. Grain would be taken to the temple. It would be threshed with rods. They didn't use a horse or an ox-drawn sledge because they didn't want any of the barley corns to be injured. They would dry them over an open flame. They would winnow them, which is take them and throw them up in the air and let the wind carry away all the chaff. And then they would mill it. They would grind it down into a very, very fine flour. And then it says they have to go until an inspector, whoever the inspector was, one of the priests, I'm sure, or a Levite, could put his hands into the flour and remove it without any flour sticking to his hands. It had to be a very, very fine flour. Then they would take an omer of it, which is about 5 pints. So That would be just a little less than a half gallon. Let me see, half gallon is 2 quarts, 5 pints would be, a little over a half a gallon. Just over a half gallon. And they would take that, it would be mixed with 3/4 of a pint of olive oil and a little bit of frankincense. And this was the first fruits offering. This is what they'd actually wave. They would do this all night long. They would spend the night preparing this flour, mixing it with the oil and the frankincense, and have it all ready. And then the next morning, which would have been a Sunday morning, what we would call Sunday morning, the priest would wave it before the Lord. A small amount would be thrown on the altar and burned, and then the rest of that would be given to the Levites. Now, each individual family would do their own thing. They would do the same way. They would harvest the barley. They'd grind it and everything. And so throughout the day on that Sunday, people would be bringing their own flour and mixed with oil and frankincense. And of course, you remember, only the men can go into the temple area. So the rest of the family would stay out. The man would go in. They would offer it. Part of it would be burned. The rest of it would be given to the Levites, because this is how they are fed for the next several months. They'll take from the offerings that the people bring. And when he gave his offering, he would quote a verse, and I didn't write out the whole verse, but in it says, "Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." And that's a very important part of this, is praising the Lord for not only for the fact that they have the barley harvest started, but also looking forward to the rest of the harvest that they will also God will provide. And then the priests would take the lamb, they'd offer it, the priests or the Levites. Sacrifice would be placed on the offering and burned, on the altar, and burned. And let's see. Remember, I just put this as a little note, but the temple at Jerusalem, where they have it built on top of the mountain, or near the top of the mountain of Mount Moriah, they kind of look at this, don't know whether it's exact, but they look at it, this is the spot that Abraham offered Isaac. It is the same mound, the same mountain area. Whether it is the exact same spot, only God knows that, but that's the way that the Jewish people look at it. And then the priest would come, the man, the husband or father, when the priest would come back after his thing, then he would read some more scripture, and it said, "I declare today to the Lord your God that I have come to the country which the Lord swore to our fathers to give us." And then he would give the flour that was after doing the lamb offering. He'd take the flour on that was in a basket on his shoulder, hand it to the priest. Priest would wave that before the altar, and he would continue with the same, I think it's in the same passage, in Deuteronomy 26. "My father was a Syrian about to perish, and he went down to Egypt, and he dwelt there, few in number, and there became a great nation, mighty and populous. He has brought us to this place and has given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, behold, I have brought the first fruits of the land which you, O Lord, have given me." And then they'd throw a handful of grain on the fire, and the man would fall down on his face and worship, and then he would return to the outer courts with the rest of his family. And then the rest of the flour, again, would go to the Levites and their families. Roman numeral 2 is the modern observance. Really, because there is no temple, the only thing that they do is what they call counting the omer. So that one I thought was up there. Yeah, counting of the omer. So what is that? Well, I told you, I believe that they celebrate on first fruits on that Saturday. And then so Sunday would be day one of counting Omer. And they count 49 days. And so actually they would start with Saturday. Anyway, when you count it up to 49 days, that begins the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost. Yeah. So 7 weeks, you have the 49 days, and day 50 is Pentecost. And the word Pentecost has to do with 50. And that's all they do now, is that they use that Saturday. They don't do the wave offering. They don't do the lamb offering. They just start that day counting until they get to day 50. So, Roman numeral 3 is application. First of all is that the first of everything belongs to God. While I was in Eufaula, we had 2 services every Sunday morning. And so I would get up and go to church for the early service while Celia and the kids stayed, and they'd come for the second service. And, I went to both because I was on staff. But going there almost every Saturday morning, there was a Seventh-day Adventist preacher I started listening to. And he was very knowledgeable in the Old Testament and these feasts and different things. And I listened to him all the time. And I thought about 2 things when I was listening to him. One, they celebrate on Saturday. They worship on Saturday because that's what the Bible says. We should, 7 days, or the 7th day God rested, which would be a Saturday. That's when the Jews do it. But Seventh-day Adventists, that's when they worship, is on Saturday. And he talked about this, the fact that Jesus rose, because he was our first fruits. I believe he rose from the dead that moment that the sun set, which to the Jewish people would be Sunday morning, right? Or Sunday, because it starts at nighttime, at dusk. And he said that was on Saturday, so that's why they worship on Saturday. And 2 reasons I think I agree with. I think we should be worshiping on Sunday. One is that is really Sunday. And I believe that Jesus rose right at that moment and did several things during the night, but didn't appear to the ladies until the sun came up the next day. But I think he rose as soon as the sun went down. But also, this says the first of everything belongs to God. And I believe that ought to be the first of our week, too, which is Sunday. So I don't have a problem at all for us to worship on Sunday. And like I said, I think it's biblical, even though it's not what they did in the Old Testament. I think it's a good thing for us to do. I told you the grain, all the different grain, every crop that they had, the barley, the wheat, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. The first of everything belonged to God. So when they went out to the field, the first time they got wheat or the first time they got grapes, they would take that first bunch and stuff that they gathered, however much it was that they wanted to give, and take it to the church, take it to the temple and give it to God. The first of their wine, the first of their oil, the first of the fleece when they sheared the sheep, the firstborn of all of the animals that they had, and the firstborn son, firstborn of Israel. So all of those were presented to God. And it wouldn't matter, you weren't to switch them out either. Even if you had an animal that was born with a defect, if you wanted to switch out and give a perfect animal to God, both of them went to God. Even the defect as well as the good one. So they didn't do that. But the firstborn son was presented to the Lord when they were 1 month old. And that son could not be redeemed. You couldn't do something else. And so he was presented to the Lord. I guess he was redeemed, but he was presented to the Lord. And that's why Jesus was taken to the temple when he was 1 month old. Who did he meet there? Do y'all remember? 2 people. When he was 1 month old and they were dedicating him. close. Anna and Simeon. Y'all remember those stories? And Simeon said, God told me I wasn't going to die until I saw the Messiah, and he got to see it. And Anna, she praised God because she also knew that she was going to get to see Jesus. And let's see where I'm at here. There's another page. Another kind of correlation, when they did the barley harvest, the wheat harvest, I don't know about any of the rest of them, but those two, you had the grain, the wheat, what do they call it? The fruit, and you had the chaff, right? And that correlates also to the final harvest, when all people go before God, and you have the separation of the sheep and the goats, those that believe God and those that don't. Other events, these are things in the Bible that happened on that same day. The Feast of First Fruits, which would be, right after Passover. That's the day that Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat. That was in Genesis 8. That was the day that the Hebrews went into Egypt. That was 430 years before they got out. The parting of the Red Sea, the day of first fruits was also the day that they entered the Promised Land and ate the fruit from the Promised Land. You remember that's the day that the manna quit going. Conquest of Jericho was on that day. Cleansing of the temple by Hezekiah, which was 800 years later. Queen Esther, when she went to save the Hebrews from being killed, that happened during that time period. And then the resurrection of Jesus. And I put these numbers in there, and you have those all printed out. I know I went really fast, so if you want to kind of click back through all of that, A through H. But it says that the odds of two of those things happen are 1 in 129,000, but of all of these 9 things or 8 things, is 1 in 783 quadrillion, 864 trillion, 876 billion, 960 million. So, yeah. Oh, could be. I've talked to Gene about this too, but I believe that the rapture is going to happen on the Feast of Trumpets. I think that's when, the Bible talks about the trumpet sounding. I think that's what it's going to be. But I could be wrong. It could come today. I don't know. All right, we have one more, and that's the Feast of Weeks that we'll talk about next week. I don't know. I thought about, and I may go back and tell you about Hanukkah and Purim, which are not feasts of God, but they are feasts that the Jewish people celebrate, and why they celebrate them, just so you know, and how they celebrate them. I may go ahead and do that. So we may have a couple of more weeks after next. Okay? Any questions, comments? All right, well, let's stand, join hands, and we will sing our dismissal chorus and then go up in the choir loft.